This is International Master Eric Kislik, and I'll be talking about how to avoid blunders. This is one of the hardest things in chess, and I think almost every single player experiences it, especially right as they start playing. So I have a bunch of useful tips for how to avoid blunders, and then I have some exercises from this website that you can go to, which I will link in the description. So the first pieces of advice I have are that I think it's very useful in every position to think about what is undefended for both sides. And an important thing to realize is that just because your queen is your most powerful piece doesn't mean that it can't be undefended. So there'll be a lot of positions where your queen might just suddenly hang in some position. Another important thing to realize is that rooks are undefended in the corner of the board right when we start the game. So there are going to be a lot of tactics where one of those rooks is hanging, and you might just simply forget about it. So you have to be very mindful about that. And you have to be aware that, let's say when you move your bishop away from f1 in the opening, or from c1, or from c8, or f8, usually you're leaving a pawn behind. You're leaving a pawn undefended. For example, if you play bishop c4 early in the opening, you're leaving the g2 pawn undefended with white. So simply being aware of a pawn on g2 or g7 being undefended is very useful, because you may suddenly notice that there are two things that you can attack at once that can't both be defended. So basically on every single move, I think about what are the weaknesses for myself and for my opponent. And that really helps me be just a little bit more aware of what the problems might be. And really, we only lose games when the opponent finds some specific weakness that they can really, hammer us down on. So as long as we don't have any major weaknesses, we're not going to lose games. I know that may sound a little bit oversimplified, but that's basically how it is. As long as we don't make any major mistakes, we're not going to lose very much. So we have to really focus on our weaknesses, and of course it's obviously unavoidable, but with more and more practice we can just become a little bit more competent and just slowly reduce errors over time. That's really what we're trying to do. And with these loose pieces exercises here, really the point here is just to become slightly more and more competent over time. So let's click on this, and I'll try to walk you through my thought process. And I think even for a beginning player, you can kind of mimic the way that I think about this. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to go just basically from left to right and be systematic. So just like I was saying, the rook is undefended. It's on its home square. I'm still going here. I see the knight is undefended. See the bishop is undefended on c4. I see the rook on e1 is undefended. And I see the pawn on g2 is undefended. And I see the queen on h6 is undefended. Just like I was saying. Okay, so the queen is again undefended. The rook on b7 is undefended. The pawn on c4 is undefended. The knight on d5 is undefended. So interestingly, the rook is undefended here again. The bishop on f5 is undefended. The knight on h5 is undefended. And the bishop on d2 is undefended. So what about this one? Again, we feature the same thing again. The rooks are all undefended. Rook on a8, besides the rook on d1. The pawn on a2. Have a bishop on c8 that's undefended. I have a queen on e5 that's undefended. Have a pawn on f2 that's undefended. I have a rook on h8 that's undefended, and a rook on h1 that's undefended. Okay, that one was easy. All right, so let's be systematic again. So the queen on c6 is defended. The rook on e1 is defended by the queen. I see that the rook on g8 is undefended. The pawn on h5 is undefended. Okay, that was all of them. So once again, the rook in the corner is undefended. This is undefended. This is undefended. The b2 pawn is undefended. The c4 pawn is not defended here. Let's keep moving over. The e7 pawn is not defended. I see the rook on g2 is not defended. Anything else? Rook on g2, and we're on to the next one. Okay, once again, the rook in the corner, undefended. I think you'll notice that's a very, very common theme that so many players forget about. Just being aware of that can make a difference of 50 elo in your play at low enough levels. So it's very useful to be aware of that. Okay, let's keep going through this. All of these are defended, and the queen is undefended here. Okay, that was all of them there. All right, once again, undefended, undefended. Kind of funny to see those over and over. Pawn on c2 is undefended. The queen on d8 is undefended. Important to recognize that. And what else? We just have the rook in the corner again. Yep. All right, so now the rook is defended. Okay, the bishop on, or the pawn on a3. Have to look at that first. I see the queen is undefended here. See the bishop on b7 is undefended here. See the pawn on c2 is undefended. The bishop on c3 defended by the rook. Pawn on d6 is undefended. The pawn on e4 is undefended. The pawn on f6 is undefended. And that's all of them. Okay, so that's ideally how we should do this. And I think that's a very useful exercise to do every day. Maybe you can do it once or twice. And unfortunately, you might go through all of the exercises, but even so, I think it's still very useful. And it's just kind of a simple way to just get better and better at recognizing when you have undefended pieces. And when your pieces defend each other, of course, they're not always going to. But when the position is slightly open, of course, there are fewer tactics in general in closed positions. So this mostly applies to semi-open and open positions. But in more open positions, you have to be really aware of all of these little tactics. And yeah, just get better and better at sort of recognizing your piece harmony and when things are undefended. And one thing that I think will help you avoid blunders, which isn't really related to tactics per se, but it's again one of my basic questions that I always ask myself, it's what's the worst place piece? Because if you have some pieces that are totally out of play, if you simply bring them into play, what that's going to mean is that your pieces will have better harmony once you bring those out of play pieces into the game. And when that happens, it's less likely that you're going to run into a devastating tactic that you simply overlooked, because your pieces will be more active and they'll be more harmonious and they'll be defending each other better. So those are my tips for avoiding blunders. I hope you're able to apply them, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks a lot.